November 26, 1943, at a Luftwaffe fighter base outside Münster, Germany, a group of Focke-Wulf 190 pilots gathered in their ready room, passing around a captured American intelligence photograph. The image showed a new fighter aircraft that had begun appearing over occupied Europe in recent weeks, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The plane in the photograph looked grotesque by the aesthetic standards of German fighter design. It was enormous, with a radial engine cowling so large it resembled a beer barrel with wings attached. The fuselage was thick and ungainly, lacking the sleek lines of the Bf-109 or the predatory elegance of their own FW-190s. Captain Heinrich Erler, a veteran with 31 confirmed victories, examined the photo and made a comment that his wingman would record in a letter home that evening. "The Americans have finally built a fighter that looks like their pilots, overfed and slow." The room erupted in laughter, the easy confidence of men who had owned the skies over Europe for 3 years. They had faced the American P-38, which was fast but could be outmaneuvered. They had fought the P-51 Mustang, which was dangerous but still relatively rare. This new American fighter, this Thunderbolt, looked like something designed by men who had never seen aerial combat, a brute force approach to a problem that required elegance and precision. Erler returned the photograph to the intelligence officer and went to prepare his aircraft for the afternoon patrol, utterly certain that if he encountered this flying tank, it would be an easy victory. He would be dead within 9 days, shot down by a P-47 he never saw coming. And his last radio transmission would consist of 4 words that ground control could barely understand through the static of a failing radio. Where is he shooting from? To understand the German pilot's contempt, you must first understand the religion of fighter design that dominated European thinking in 1943. German aviation engineers had spent 2 decades refining the concept of the fighter aircraft as a lightweight, highly maneuverable gun platform. Every kilogram of weight was scrutinized, every design choice evaluated for its impact on turning radius and climb rate. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's primary fighter, weighed just over 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The Focke-Wulf 190 was slightly heavier, but compensated with brutal acceleration and roll rate. Both aircraft could outturn almost anything in the sky, and German pilots had been trained in tactics that exploited these characteristics, tight spiraling dogfights where agility meant survival. When intelligence reports began arriving about the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, German analysts noted its specifications with something close to disbelief. The aircraft weighed over 13,000 pounds, more than twice the weight of a Bf-109. Its radial engine displaced 2,800 cubic inches, larger than many truck engines. It was 8 feet longer than a standard German fighter and had a wingspan that seemed to belong on a medium bomber. The German assessment, filed in October 1943, concluded with remarkable confidence. The P-47 represents American industrial excess applied to fighter design. Its weight and size will make it vulnerable in close combat. Pilots should engage aggressively and exploit superior maneuverability. This assessment was distributed to every Luftwaffe fighter squadron on the Western Front. It would prove to be one of the deadliest intelligence failures of the air war. What German intelligence had documented were the P-47's dimensions. What they had completely failed to understand was what those dimensions contained. The Thunderbolt hadn't been designed to outturn German fighters. It had been designed to survive everything they could throw at it, and then destroy them with overwhelming firepower. The massive radial engine wasn't a design flaw. It was a turbocharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower, giving the Thunderbolt speeds in excess of 400 miles per hour in level flight. The bulky fuselage wasn't excess weight. It housed armor plating that protected the pilot from the front, sides and rear, along with self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb dozens of hits without catastrophic failure. And mounted in those wings, this was the detail that German intelligence had noted but not truly comprehended, were 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt produced a weight of fire that exceeded anything flying in the European theater. But numbers on an intelligence report couldn't convey what that actually meant in combat, and German pilots would have to learn through the cruelest teacher, experience. The education began in earnest in December 1943, when P-47 squadrons started flying escort missions for American bomber formations, penetrating deep into German-held territory. German fighter tactics against bombers were well established. Avoid the fighter escorts. Approach the bomber formations from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Make quick attack passes and disengage before escorts could respond. These tactics had worked effectively against the smaller American fighter forces earlier in the year. But the Thunderbolts didn't behave like previous escort fighters. They didn't stay locked in tight formation above the bombers. Instead, they ranged ahead and to the sides, hunting aggressively for any German fighters attempting to approach the bomber stream. And when they found them, they attacked with a methodology that seemed almost industrial. Captain Erler encountered his first Thunderbolt on December 5, 1943, during an intercept mission against American B-17 bombers near Emden. His flight of 4 FW-190s had climbed to altitude and was positioning for an attack run when his wingman called out contacts. 4 large fighters approaching from the south at high speed. Erler wasn't concerned. 4 against 4 was acceptable odds, and if these were the rumored Thunderbolts, their size and weight would make them easy prey once he could force them into a turning engagement. He banked toward the approaching fighters, established his lead, and prepared to open fire. The Americans saw him coming. That was clear from their formation shift. But instead of turning to evade or maneuvering for position, the Thunderbolts did something Erler hadn't anticipated. They accelerated directly toward his formation in a head-on pass. In German fighter doctrine, head-on attacks were considered desperately risky. The closure rate was enormous, the firing window was minuscule, and both aircraft were equally vulnerable. But as the range closed to within 800 meters, all 4 Thunderbolts opened fire simultaneously, and Erler flew into a wall of tracers so dense it looked like a solid object. The sound was the first shock, not the sharp crack of cannon fire that Erler was accustomed to, but a sustained mechanical roar like a factory's machinery, a continuous thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His FW-190 shuddered as rounds impacted the wings and cowling, and his windscreen starred with cracks from strikes that miraculously didn't penetrate. Erler broke hard right, abandoning his attack run entirely, and looked back to see one of his wingmen trailing smoke and beginning a steep descent. The Thunderbolts hadn't turned to pursue. They'd simply blown through his formation, executed a climbing turn that shouldn't have been possible for aircraft that heavy, and were now positioning for another pass. Erler's training, his experience, his 31 victories, none of it had prepared him for this kind of combat. The Americans weren't fighting a dogfight. They were executing a mechanical process of destruction, and his formation was the raw material. What Erler couldn't see from his cockpit was the tactical revolution those 8 50 caliber guns represented. German and British fighters typically mounted 2 or 4 machine guns or cannons, weapons that required precision aiming and careful ammunition management. The Thunderbolt carried 8 guns with over 400 rounds per gun, more than 3,000 rounds of ammunition total. This meant American pilots didn't need to be surgical with their fire. They could afford to spray, to saturate an area of sky with bullets, to fire in long bursts that would have exhausted a German fighter's ammunition supply in seconds. And those 50 caliber rounds weren't the rifle caliber bullets that most machine guns fired. They were heavy projectiles, originally designed to destroy light vehicles and fortifications. And when they struck an aircraft, they didn't just punch holes. They shredded hydraulic lines, destroyed control surfaces, shattered engine components, and wounded or killed pilots even through armor that could stop smaller rounds. A single 2-second burst from a P-47 represented 1,600 rounds in the air. And if even 5% of those rounds found their target, it was usually enough to destroy or cripple any single-engine fighter. Erler managed to escape that first encounter by diving away and using every meter of altitude he'd gained to build separation. But his wingman didn't make it home. The after-action report Erler filed that evening was notably different in tone from his morning confidence. He wrote, "New American fighter extremely heavily armed. Recommend avoiding head-on engagements. Aircraft appears difficult to damage with standard armament." It was a careful, professional assessment, but between the lines was shock, the shock of a veteran pilot who had encountered something that invalidated his training. The report went up the chain of command, and 3 days later, German pilots received a tactical bulletin advising caution when engaging P-47s, but caution wasn't enough against an aircraft that had been designed from the beginning to dominate by firepower rather than maneuverability. Over the next 2 months, Luftwaffe losses over Germany began to climb at a rate that alarmed the German high command. The losses weren't just to the bombers' defensive fire. They were increasingly from American escort fighters, and the P-47 was responsible for a disproportionate share. German tactical reports from this period make for grim reading. They describe the same pattern repeatedly. German fighters would attempt to intercept bomber formations, would be engaged by P-47s before reaching the bombers, and would suffer losses they couldn't sustain. One report from January 1944, filed by a squadron commander whose name was lost when the records were destroyed, included a passage that captured the growing fear: "The Thunderbolt does not fight like a fighter. It fights like a bomber that happens to be fast. It cannot be avoided, cannot be outrun at most altitudes, and when engaged, produces fire volume that makes accurate return fire impossible." Pilots report the psychological effect of facing this weapon is severe. That phrase, psychological effect, appeared with increasing frequency in German combat reports from early 1944. It wasn't just that pilots were being shot down. It was that they were being shot down in ways that felt overwhelming and impersonal. In traditional dogfighting, there was a dual quality to the combat: pilot skill against pilot skill, aircraft capability against aircraft capability. But fighting the Thunderbolt felt like being caught in machinery, and the stress of that experience was breaking even veteran pilots. Captain Erler, who had laughed at the Thunderbolt photograph in November, stopped laughing in January. His letters home took on a fatalistic quality, and his ground crew noticed he'd stopped joking before missions. On December 14th, during a mission to intercept bombers near Bremen, his FW-190 was hit by fire from a P-47 he never visually acquired. The American pilot had fired from outside Erler's visual range, and the concentration of 50 caliber rounds was so dense that his aircraft was effectively sawed apart in mid-air. He managed to transmit those 4 words, "Where is he shooting from?" before his radio failed. His body was never recovered. The Thunderbolt supremacy wasn't just about firepower, it was about survivability. German pilots who did manage to land hits on P-47s discovered that damaging them was entirely different from destroying them. The armor protection that had made the aircraft so heavy meant that weapons that could cripple a Bf-109 or FW-190 merely scarred the Thunderbolt's hide. The radial engine, which German pilots had mocked as primitive compared to their inline engines, could absorb incredible damage and keep running. One P-47 famously returned to base after taking more than 200 hits from cannon and machine gun fire, including strikes that removed 3 feet of wing and destroyed half the tail section. The pilot walked away without injury. Stories like these spread through the Luftwaffe ranks, and they corroded morale in ways that official pronouncements couldn't repair. When pilots believe their weapons are inadequate and their opponents are invulnerable, combat effectiveness collapses. By March 1944, German Fighter Command had issued revised tactical guidance for engaging P-47s, and the change in doctrine was striking. The new guidance didn't explain how to defeat the Thunderbolt, it explained how to avoid it. Pilots were instructed to attack only when they held overwhelming altitude advantage, to make a single fast pass and then disengage immediately, and to never, under any circumstances, attempt sustained combat with a P-47 formation. These weren't tactics, they were survival instructions, and even these cautious measures weren't enough. The problem was simple mathematics. The P-47 could go where it wanted, fight when it wanted, and disengage when it wanted. Its speed at altitude matched or exceeded German fighters. Its dive performance was superior, and its firepower meant that even brief encounters could be lethal. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the tactical equation. The most damning assessment came from Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, the Luftwaffe's most senior fighter commander, and himself a decorated combat veteran. In a February 1944 meeting with Hermann Göring, Galland presented casualty figures and combat reports that painted a stark picture. He told Göring, in a conversation that was recorded in meeting minutes, "We are losing experienced pilots at a rate we cannot sustain. The primary cause is the American escort fighters, particularly the P-47. Our aircraft are adequate. Our pilots are brave, but they are being asked to engage an opponent who has an advantage in every parameter that matters: firepower, protection, and sustainability. This is not combat, it is attrition, and we are on the wrong side of the mathematics." Göring, according to the minutes, demanded to know why German fighters couldn't simply be equipped with heavier weapons. Galland's response was telling. "We can add guns, but adding guns to make our fighters as heavily armed as the Thunderbolt would make them too heavy to perform. The Americans built their fighter around the guns. We would be modifying our fighters to carry guns they weren't designed for. It's not the same thing." That distinction, building around a capability versus adding it later, was the heart of why the Thunderbolt shocked German aviation thinking. German fighters had been optimized for dogfighting, then asked to take on bomber escort and ground attack roles they weren't designed for. The Thunderbolt had been designed from the beginning as a heavy fighter bomber, and everything about its construction reflected that purpose. It could escort bombers because it had the range and the survivability. It could fight German interceptors because it had the speed and the firepower. And increasingly as 1944 progressed, it could also obliterate ground targets because those 850 caliber guns could destroy trucks, trains, and aircraft on the ground with the same efficiency they destroyed aircraft in the air. The Luftwaffe had to defend against all three threats simultaneously, and they had no aircraft capable of matching the P-47 in even one of those roles, much less all of them. In the spring of 1944, a captured Thunderbolt was transported to the Luftwaffe test center at Rechlin for evaluation. German test pilots flew the aircraft and filed technical reports that confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting. The P-47 was faster than expected, more maneuverable than its size suggested, and when they tested the guns on a ground range, the test pilots used words like devastating and unbelievable. One test pilot's report included a note that the psychological impact of firing all 8 guns simultaneously was significant even for the pilot. The aircraft shook, the noise was overwhelming, and the visible impact on the target was so dramatic that it was difficult to believe it was coming from a fighter aircraft. The report concluded with the recommendation that was quietly filed and never acted upon. If resources permit, consider fundamental redesign of fighter doctrine to prioritize firepower and survivability over maneuverability. Resources didn't permit. Germany was already losing the industrial war, and by the time they understood what the Thunderbolt represented, it was far too late to respond. The P-47 Thunderbolt would go on to fly more missions than any other American fighter in the European theater. It would destroy more ground targets than any other Allied aircraft, and it would shoot down nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft, despite being designed primarily as an escort and ground attack platform. But its greatest impact wasn't measured in kills. It was measured in the psychological weight it placed on the Luftwaffe. German pilots who took off knowing they might encounter Thunderbolts flew differently, fought differently, and died differently than pilots who believed they controlled the sky. The confidence that had characterized the Luftwaffe in 1940 was gone by 1944, replaced by grim professionalism and the understanding that every mission might be the last. There's a photograph from May 1945, taken at a Luftwaffe airfield in Bavaria after the German surrender. American soldiers are walking among rows of abandoned German fighters, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even a few of the advanced jet-powered Me-262s. In the foreground of the image, clearly visible, is a crashed P-47 Thunderbolt that had come down during a ground attack mission, its massive engine buried in the German soil. An American soldier is standing on the wing, and a group of German pilots, now prisoners, are gathered around it. One of the German pilots has his hand on the engine cowling, and his face shows something that isn't quite respect and isn't quite fear. It's the look of a man confronting a thing he never fully understood but learned to dread. They had called it a flying tank, meant as an insult, meant to suggest it was clumsy and vulnerable. They'd been half right. It was a tank, an armored instrument of overwhelming force. But it flew faster than their fighters, hit harder than their cannons, and survived what would have killed anything they flew. By the time they understood that, the sky was full of them, and laughter had long since turned to silence.